Now, Libya, what's the latest in Libya? Those of you who have been following my podcast would know that last month I mentioned Libya as the top story. The civil conflict between the internationally recognized and UN-backed government in Tripoli, known as the GNA, versus the rival government in the east, which is propped up by renegade commander Khalifa Haftar. This civil conflict brought in many actors, many players, many mercenaries from different parts of the world. It almost split up allies in Europe, such as Italy and France, and could have triggered World War III. Now, since last month, things have calmed down slightly. There are still hostilities, there are still tensions. Fighting is still going on between Khalifa Haftar's forces and the forces of the Tripoli government. But this time last month, Haftar, going into the ceasefire talks in Berlin, he actually seemed on the verge of taking Tripoli and establishing himself as the sole authority in the country. But since then, he has been stalled just outside of Tripoli at the Mytika airport. A lot of clashes are happening there. In fact, a few times flights to and from Mytika airport have been cancelled because of attacks in and around the airport by Khalifa Haftar's forces. And that is still ongoing. But in fact, now not only has Haftar been stalled at the airport, he's not being able to make any progress beyond that airport. The airport is very heavily saturated by Turkish troops who have come to the aid of the Tripoli government. But now actually the Tripoli government themselves say that they are not just defending the airport, but they are preparing a counterattack against Haftar's forces. So I doubt that Haftar will be able to get any further west of that airport. What is the most likely scenario, in my opinion, is that this is how it's going to stay. Neither the Eastern government is going to oust the Western government, nor is the Western government going to oust the East. There's going to be some kind of ceasefire. Eventually, they're going to have to come to terms in terms of how to resume the export of Libyan oil to the outside world in order to rejuvenate Libya's economy, because under the current situation there is a blockade. No oil is being exported, and the Libyan economy as a whole is suffering. Libyan people as a whole are suffering, both east and west. So eventually they're going to have to overcome this dispute and start looking out for the interest of the Libyan people. Now, probably Turkey is going to consolidate its foothold in Tripoli. And that's all it really needs. Turkey does not need the government in Tripoli to take control of the whole country. What Turkey really needs in Libya is an ally, and they have that ally in the UN-backed government. And so long as that ally is there, then Turkey, the deal between the maritime deal that was struck in December between Turkey and the UN-backed government in Tripoli will remain, and Turkey will be able to assert itself as a maritime power even more than it already is in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that's all Turkey wants. What happens east of Tripoli, I don't really think Turkey is too concerned. Haftar, meanwhile, acknowledging that he probably cannot advance further west, he probably cannot take the city of Tripoli, he will probably do his best to consolidate whatever he can in the east of the country. He has not received the support to the level that he was looking for. Yes, the United Arab Emirates are continuing to send him weapons and funds. Yes, he does have mercenaries, Russian mercenaries particularly, fighting on his side. But it's not enough for him to fight against Turkey and to oust Turkey and the UN-backed government from Tripoli. France is giving its spiritual support. Egypt is giving its spiritual support. But Egypt is not going to give, neither of them rather, are going to give any military support to Haftar. France has got other interests in working together with Turkey, which it doesn't want to jeopardize. And at the same time, Egypt sees a military intervention in Libya as being too costly and has very little return on investment. Now, Egypt is actually already on the edge economically. In February last month rather, Egypt saw the birth of its 100 millionth citizen, and it's suffering from overpopulation as it is. It's suffering from disputes over its water resources and water management. Now, Egypt is still very heavily dependent on the River Nile. Upwards of 90% of its population still live along the River Nile. There's very little opportunity outside of that. The entire agricultural sector is based on the Nile, and there is currently a dispute with Ethiopia over a dam that's being built at the source of the Nile in Ethiopia, which could actually lower the amount of water, reduce the amount of water that is being pumped into Egypt, and severely affect Egypt's economy, and particularly the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector of Egypt already is actually consuming more water than the River Nile can supply. So Egypt has a lot of questions that it needs to answer about its future, its economic future, and being able to look after a population of 100 million people, a huge proportion of which are actually under the age of 25. It needs to consider how it's going to create jobs and opportunities for these people in order to avoid some kind of rebellion. Now, one thing that Egypt was looking forward to was the export of gas. Egypt has been working in the Eastern Mediterranean to identify sources of hydrocarbons that it could perhaps begin to export to the European market in order to rejuvenate its economy. But many experts are saying that there is a gas glut being predicted. The Zohr gas field in Egypt's waters, is not going to deliver as much as it promises, and Egypt will not be able to enter that market. So Egypt really needs to start looking for other ways. In terms of military expansion, that's always an option. Whenever a country is in a situation like Egypt is today, it needs new pastures for its people in order to keep them happy, in order to keep them in employment, and in order to keep things going. But with Egypt just locked along the River Nile, east and west of that is just full of desert. There's not really much livable space that Egypt can move into geographically. So actually it's probably better for Libya, for Haftar, to not allow Egypt to get involved militarily, because if Egypt is going to send its army into Libya to do all of the fighting, they're going to be shedding their blood on Libyan soil. Then after the war's done, even if Haftar was to win that war with Egyptian support, Egypt will want something back, and they would be in their right to request priority in terms of job opportunities and business and influence in the region. So there is that element that Haftar in Libya needs to consider as well. But what Haftar is doing to counter the Western government and to counter Turkey's influence in the region is it's actually his Eastern Libyan government is actually working to create an aura of legitimacy around itself by establishing diplomatic relations with other countries. Now, one thing that happened this week particularly was that a delegation from the Eastern Libyan government went to meet with the Syrian regime leader Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, and they agreed to establish diplomatic missions in both countries, and they signed a memorandum of understanding to counter what they call Turkish aggression in both countries. Now, this agreement was probably on the whole no more than a symbolic gesture, but it is creating the illusion that the Haftar regime in Libya has more legitimacy. It has the backing of Arab countries such as Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and now Syria. And they are, in a way, the Haftar regime and the Assad regime in Syria are helping each other regain some kind of legitimacy as Arab governments. Now, in Syria, ever since the death of Iranian Quds Force commander General Qasem Soleimani at the beginning of January 2020, we've seen certain roles are starting to evolve in Syria particularly. I feel that Iran's influence in Syria and in the Middle East as a whole, since the death of Soleimani, has actually been capped. As in, under Soleimani, they were enjoying many victories. Their influence was spreading all over the region. They seem to be on the verge of creating a corridor from Iran through the Middle East into the Mediterranean, which would have established Iran as a superpower in the region. But since the death of Soleimani, they've not been able to continue that momentum. And that's actually, I believe, that was the intention actually of the US assassination of the Iranian general at the beginning of January, to back Iran, to make Iran back down, and to make it start behaving itself. And I spoke more about that issue in last month's podcast. But at the same time, Iranian proxies in Syria, that they enjoy Iranian support, but they're not under direct Iranian control, such as Hezbollah. They also have not been able to utilize their resources in Syria to the extent that they might like, to the maximum extent. And that's also because of domestic issues that Hezbollah is facing in its native country of Lebanon. Political issues, which I will be speaking about later. Now, that's regarding Iran. Now, when it comes to the Syrian opposition, we're seeing a slight shift as well there. Now, the Syrian opposition in the past, in the early days of the Syrian civil conflict, was seen as being very close to Turkey. It was also enjoying support from other countries as well, namely Saudi Arabia. But in the past couple of months, there has been a shift within the political Syrian opposition, in that those opposition figures who are seen as being close to Turkey are being pushed down the ladder, whereas opposition figures who are seen as closer to Saudi Arabia are being pushed up. Now, there's one particular member of the Syrian opposition who we need to look out for. His name is Nibras al-Fadl. This is a very interesting person to look out for, because Nibras al-Fadl, actually, he's not truly a member of the Syrian opposition. This man was once an advisor to Bashar al-Assad, and he is also, very interestingly, he's also an Alawite. He belongs to the same religious sect as President Bashar al-Assad. But since December, with Saudi Arabian support, he has been able to enter the High Negotiations Committee, and there are many rumors actually that he may be pushed to take on the leadership of the High Negotiations Committee, which is the main faction, Syrian opposition faction. Now, when it comes to regime leader Bashar al-Assad, he also seems to be turning more to his Ba'athist roots as an Arab socialist. Now, throughout the majority of the Syrian civil conflict, the main narrative that was in existence was, at least among the Syrian opposition, was that the Syrian opposition was mainly Sunni Muslim by identity, Sunni Muslim Arab, but Sunni Muslim first, above everything else. And Assad was being portrayed as an Alawite, which is a sect of Shia Islam, an ideology that Iran propagates. He was seen as a puppet of Iran. Obviously, Iran not being an Arab country as well, made Assad seem like a foreign agent in a way. Now, what Assad has done by reaching out recently to the Eastern government in Libya and making an alliance with Khalifa Haftar's forces, Assad is trying to show himself more as an Arab leader. He's balancing out the Iranian support that he's getting with Arab support. And Khalifa Haftar is allowing Assad to do that because despite what other Arab nations may think of Assad, Khalifa Haftar is somebody that Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt particularly are supporting, these key Arab countries. Now with Assad also facing assaults from Turkey in northwestern Syria, as well as Israeli airstrikes, these actions by Turkey and Israel are reinforcing Assad, his image as an Arab leader who is facing non-Arab aggression. So it's doing well for his image politically, and it's enabling people to forget about the atrocities that he and his regime have committed throughout the years of the Syrian civil conflict, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people. But it's very clear now that Assad has won the war, and Assad is going to remain in power. And other countries are looking for a way to continue working with Syria, whether they like it or not, with Assad in power. So there is an attempt on behalf of those who are keen to continue working with Syria under these conditions to redeem Assad, to redeem his image, so that they don't look bad by working with him and cooperating with him. So Assad, despite being an Alawite, he is no longer seen as an Alawite leader or as an Iranian agent. He is now starting to go back to his Ba'athist roots, to be seen as a secular Arab socialist leader. And he has all of the ingredients in place in order to make that remedy for his image work. Now, when it comes to the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is mainly comprised of the YPG, pro-PKK Kurdish fighters, their image and their allegiances in Syria is also changing. Now, the Syrian Kurds, or pro-PKK Kurds in general, throughout history, being that they are actually left-wing, they are actually Marxist-Leninists originally, they were seen as being very close to Russia, to the Soviet Union. We're talking about the 70s, the 80s, early 90s. And Russia being, the Soviet Union rather, in those days, during the Cold War days, being seen as the biggest threat. Anything that was left-wing, that was emerging in the Middle East or anywhere in the world, was seen as a threat by the West. So any country that was fighting against that, in this case Turkey, would have been given the full support of NATO and the West in order to make sure that doesn't spread, those rebellions don't spread. However, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the PKK and its offshoots such as YPG, they've kind of also undergone a transition in their approach to politics. In the past, their hardcore, staunch left-wing ideology was not gaining them a lot of support from Kurdish people in general, because Kurdish people in general, first of all, they are actually quite conservative. They are Muslim. So the version of communism, atheist communism, that they were preaching, that they were supporting back in those days, was not appealing really to the Kurdish masses. But now the YPG, not only to just gain the support of foreign powers, YPG, PKK, so many abbreviations for these groups, but they're all really working as one. In order to gain support of the foreign powers, in order to boost their public image, and to gain the support of the Kurdish people, they have been presenting themselves as a more democratic force. And to a certain extent, that did work in Syria, in that they got the US to support them in Syria to fight against ISIS. Now, the US having helped the YPG, STF, whatever you want to call them, having helped them secure most of eastern Syria, east of the Euphrates, especially the areas where all of Syria's oil fields are, then having seen that the US pulled out of Syria and left the YPG to fend for themselves, the YPG, in the face of Turkish assaults on territories to their north that they control, they started turning towards their traditional ally, Russia, for support. They've never actually been anti-Russian, despite enjoying the support of the US. And I think that's actually one of the main reasons why the US might have actually pulled out of Syria, because they realized that despite all of the support that they've given to the SDF and to the YPG, despite all of that, and despite risking so much in regards to their relations with Turkey for the sake of these people, that these people still have not cut off their spiritual affiliation to Russia. And to see that immediately, as soon as the US pulled out of Syria, this group, the SDF YPG, turned towards the Assad regime, which is obviously another element that the US is trying to suppress in the Middle East. For the US to see this basically shows that the YPG, SDF, PKK, whatever you want to call them, have always had their own agenda. So now we're seeing that the YPG, SDF, PKK are siding more with Assad, Bashar al-Assad, in order to consolidate Syria as a socialist country in which minorities such as the Kurds will have more of a say and will be boosted in seeing that the Sunni Muslim majority, the Arabs of Syria, are suppressed. So we're seeing Assad turn back to his Ba'athist roots, and we're also seeing the Syrian Kurds turning towards Assad. But there will be a slight change to the Baathism that Assad stood for before the war and the Baathism that Assad stands for now, in that Assad was an Arab socialist. That's what Baathist basically means. Now he may have to just accept that he is a socialist without the Arab elements involved, because under the previous Baathism that existed in Syria before the civil war broke out, the Syrian Kurds, we're talking about 200,000 people, were not even offered Syrian citizenship because they were treated as foreigners. But now, having succeeded in controlling half of the country east of the Euphrates, the Kurds are in a position where they can demand rights and actually get those rights from the Assad regime. So in a way, Syria, in order to continue with Assad, in order to continue on this path of socialism, it may have to tone down the Arab element of Baathism and promote itself more as a socialist country, for all groups, particularly minority groups, provided that all of them are united in suppressing the majority Sunni Muslim people of Syria in order to maintain this identity. And among those minority groups is the Orthodox Christian minority in Syria. Now, they are not in a position of strength in order to start asserting themselves politically. But with the Sunni Muslim element of Syria being suppressed, and with the minorities working together, united, and boosting each other up in order to maintain some kind of monopoly over Syria as a state, with this happening, the Orthodox community will definitely enjoy being boosted by Russia, which I mentioned earlier is seeing itself as a third Rome, which is seeking to consolidate Orthodox proxies and power and allegiances in the Middle East. And actually, if you ask me, Russia would prefer to work more with another party in Syria besides Assad's Baathists, and this is a minority party in Syria, a small party, but at the same time a very old party and a very influential party, which I can see growing in power in the coming decades, and they are called the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, SSNP. Many referring to their logo, which looks almost like a swastika, refer to them as a Nazi party. Obviously, the party would deny their allegiance to the Nazis, but one thing that this party does propagate is a greater Syria, a Syria based upon its traditional borders, if you know, theological borders, let's say, and these borders extend to include countries like Lebanon. It extends to include the southeastern Turkish province of Hatay, and it extends to include the island of Cyprus, believe it or not. And actually, one commentary I can make about this party propagating the expansion of Syria into these areas is that this party was originally set up by Orthodox Syrians, Christian Orthodox Syrians, and by spreading into these territories where Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, has a long history and has and still has populations, it would boost their role in Syria as a state, being that the majority of Cyprus, for example, is Orthodox Christian. In Hatay, in the ancient city of Antakya, it's a headquarters for the Orthodox Church, and Lebanon has many Maronites and other Christian minorities, including Orthodox. So the SSNP, the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, is, I believe, Russia's preferred ally in Syria, and I believe that they will take on a greater role in the future as a party. However, for the time being that they are not in the position to start taking direct control and assert themselves more directly, we might see the regime of Bashar al-Assad start pivoting more towards those who would typically vote for such a party. We may see some kind of merger, some kind of coalition, some kind of alliance between the Baathists and the SSNP, as well as with the YPG. So we can see Syria in a way transitioning away from its Arab identity into a more Syrian, more inclusive Syrian socialist identity under Bashar al-Assad in the future. Speaking of Lebanon, there is another evolution taking place in Lebanon, in that the economic crisis and the corruption that's taking place in the country has left many of its civilians of all sects feeling isolated and feeling disenfranchised by the not only the government that's in charge now, but the entire political system of Lebanon. And for those of you who don't know, Lebanon has a quota-based political system in that it tries to give representation, fair representation, to its major sects. So that includes Sunni Muslims. The Prime Minister has to be a Sunni Muslim. To Maronite Christians, the President has to be a Maronite Christian, and to Shias as well. So it's a sectarian-based government, and the parties that people vote for usually depend on their sect. So the Sunnis of Lebanon will tend to vote for Saad Hariri's party, which is the Future Movement. Saad Hariri being the son of the late Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri and the former Prime Minister himself. The Maronites will tend to vote for the Free Patriotic Movement, which is led by Gebran Basil. He's a Maronite himself and also the son-in-law of the Maronite president Michael Owen. And the Shias will vote for parties established by Hezbollah. Now, that's traditionally been the case, but the current economic woes of Lebanon is something that is not just affecting one sect or another. This is a situation which is affecting the entire population of Lebanon. Lebanon is due to pay $1.2 billion in Eurobonds on March the 9th. It may risk defaulting on its debts. But at the same time, groups like Hezbollah have been pressuring the current government to not accept any help from groups like the IMF because it may undermine Hezbollah's influence and Iran's influence rather on Lebanon. Excuse me. Now, Saad Hariri, the former prime minister who resigned because of discontent with his leadership, he is actually right now seeing the situation, and he is trying to reinvent himself and reinvent his image as a voice for the people. Previously, his power sharing agreement between his future party and his Michael Owen, the president Michael Owen, that broke down. He resigned, and now he is voicing the concerns. He is doing his best to voice the concerns of the people of Lebanon against the entire political system. And he's also he withdrew his party's support for the new government that was established under the new Prime Minister Hassan Diab, and he has been heavily criticizing Gebran Basil, the head of the Free Patriotic Movement, for he's accused him of being a shadow president, which is trying to obliterate all other parties in the country, taking advantage of the fact, hitting on the fact that Gebran Basil is actually the son-in-law of the actual president, Michael Owen. Now, the same way that the Sunnis and the Shias are feeling very disenfranchised by the current political situation in Lebanon, the Maronite people, the Maronite Church themselves, have even expressed their opposition to President Michael Owen, despite he himself being a Maronite. At the same time, Hezbollah is coming under pressure for looking after its own interest and putting perhaps even Iran's interest in Lebanon above the interest of the people. One example of that is that the coronavirus has been spreading in Lebanon. After Iran, Lebanon is the second most affected country by the coronavirus, and a lot of blame has been placed on that on the health minister of Lebanon, who has affiliations to Hezbollah, who has refused to halt the air traffic between Lebanon and Iran. Obviously, Iran has an outbreak of coronavirus. It's struggling to control it. It's becoming an epidemic in the country. And while other countries are actually putting controls and limitations on people coming from Iran into their countries, Lebanon, being that there are many Shias in Lebanon, Hezbollah has a strong voice in Lebanon, and and Hezbollah is very closely aligned to Iran. Being the case, the Lebanese health minister actually not encouraging, not supporting a halt or a limitation or controls on flights coming from Iran has been fingered as the thing to blame for the outbreak of coronavirus in Lebanon itself. Now, the whole political situation being as it is, and people being discontent and calling for change and reform, it's quite a tense situation, because as much as the people may want to see a change in Lebanon, may want to see a reform of the political system, in reality it's going to be very difficult to achieve, because if any side in Lebanon was to be angered by any change that's taking place, it's a very delicate situation. There is a very delicate balance of power in Lebanon. Any change to that could lead to civil conflict, could lead to catastrophe. Now, one tactic that groups in Lebanon, particularly Hezbollah, may resort to in order to take people's attentions away from the corruption, to take people's attention away from the economic problems, is to actually provoke some kind of conflict, particularly with Israel in the south of Lebanon. Excuse me. Now, there is a very delicate truce between Israel and Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon that's been in place since the last conflict between Israel and Lebanon in 2006. Now, Israel is accusing Hezbollah of violating some terms in that truce, and I know that one particular Israeli general has come out and threatened to attack the south of Lebanon, to attack Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon if Hezbollah continues to do this. Now, if Israel was to do such a thing, if they were to attack Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon, that would actually give Hezbollah a lifeline. It will help them regain its image as a savior of Lebanon, the same image that it had when it was fighting Israel in the 80s, the same image it had when it was fighting Israel in 2006, where many people around the world were, including Sunni and Christian Lebanese people, were actually coming out and marching in support of Hezbollah, because they were seen as a defender of Lebanon, as a defender of the Lebanese people. So in order for Hezbollah to tap into that energy once again, they would have to provoke some kind of conflict with Israel. And in that case, if something like that was to happen, if there was to be another war with Israel, a lot of the economic problems that Lebanon is going through right now could be blamed on the conflict, could be blamed on Israel, and blame would be deflected away from Hezbollah and onto an outside actor. Onto Israel. Israel just held its third national election in a year, and again Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing bloc, led by his party, the Likud party, has come out on top. They have, the last time I checked, they had 59 seats, too short of a majority in the Israeli parliament, and his inability to get a majority is mainly down to the right-wing political leader Avigdor Lieberman, who withdrew his support for Netanyahu, who has been an adversary of Netanyahu for a long time now, and who actually tried to sabotage, in a way, Netanyahu's victory by coming out with revelations before the election that Benjamin Netanyahu had held secret talks with Qatar in order to make sure that there are deliveries of aid and financial support to the Palestinians in Gaza. However, it is still considered a victory for Netanyahu. He might declare a minority government and still have enough seats with the parties in his right-wing bloc to get past most of the legislation that he wants. Or he could reconcile with Lieberman, whose party took 7 seats in the election, and establish a majority, which seems to be the natural thing to do for both men. Now, when it comes to the Israeli left wing, the blue and white movement that was led by Benny Gantz, they need to perhaps look to reinvent themselves in order to start appealing more to the Israeli public. Now, they didn't perform too badly in the election. They got 54 seats, just a couple of seats less, 5 seats less than the right-wing bloc. But in order for them to get the majority, they would need to encourage Lieberman to support them. Lieberman plays the role of the kingmaker in this situation, but Lieberman, being right-wing himself, is very unlikely to give his support to the left. He's more likely to give his support to Benjamin Netanyahu. However, there is a lifeline available for the Blue and White Party, and that could be by joining up with the Joint List, which is a pro-Arab party in Israel. They enjoy the support of many Palestinian Israeli citizens, and they are actually the third biggest party in the Israeli parliament. They took 15 seats. So if the Blue and White left-wing alliance was to join up with the Joint List, they could actually achieve a majority and establish a new government. However, we have to keep in mind that we are speaking about Israel here, and one of the core elements that all parties besides the Joint List promote, one of the core ideologies, core ideals, is that they're all Zionist and they are all pro-Israeli. Now, the Joint List being that they are made up of Israeli Arabs or Israeli Palestinians, they don't subscribe to this ideology. They do not support Israel as a state, and they are by all means pro-Palestinian. So most parties in Israel are reluctant to have any affiliation with the Joint List. It's something that they do not want to do. They do not want to be seen as pro-Palestinian, because that would probably mean that they would lose the majority of their voters. So even though the Blue and White movement does have this opportunity to make an allegiance with the Joint List and to become a majority, they probably would not take that opportunity, because they would prefer to be an opposition party than to team up with a pro-Palestinian party. That being said, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, what happens with him, even if he does establish a majority, is still not very clear, because on March the 17th, Benjamin Netanyahu actually faces trial for corruption, and it is likely that if he is found guilty, he may be called to step down, to resign. He may actually have to serve a term in prison. So with him being elected, re-elected as Prime Minister, if he remains Prime Minister, there's a higher likelihood that he will avoid a prison term because of political reasons, behind the legal structure. He may be more likely to survive his trial. So for him, being re-elected as Prime Minister was something that he personally needed to achieve to stay out of prison. But I'm not saying that he's not going to prison. He may be, if he's found guilty, we have to keep in mind that whatever your opinion of Israel is, it is a country of law. If he is found guilty, he may have to step aside, and somebody else from his right-wing bloc, from the Likud party, may have to take over as prime minister. So that's a bit ambiguous right there, what's going to happen regarding Netanyahu. But one thing that is for sure is that the Israeli right-wing has shown that it does have the support of its people to continue upon the trajectory that it's been set on. And that trajectory, as we have seen in Donald Trump's Middle East, in his words, peace plan, is set on annexing parts of the West Bank and really denying true Palestinian statehood and a equally beneficial peace deal with the Palestinians. And it seems to be working, because it seems that even the Arab countries in the Middle East are starting to turn their favor towards Israel. And with Qasem Soleimani out of the way and Iran's influence in the Middle East getting capped, even pro-Iranian proxies such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip are starting to realize their limitations when it comes to fighting Israel. After some skirmishes in Gaza earlier in February, Islamic Jihad decided to call a ceasefire and to keep the peace in Gaza, because they realized that they could not take on Israel militarily. So this situation has really forced even the Palestinians themselves to reassess what kind of approach they're going to take for challenging and for campaigning for Palestinian rights in future with Israel. And again, on another side note, I just want to mention that earlier in February, that Benjamin Netanyahu, he actually secured some kind of deal with Sudan after meeting with the Sudan Sovereign Council Chief Fatah al-Burhan. Now, keep in mind that Sudan has also undergone recently a regime change. Sudan traditionally has been very much opposed to Israel, has been a big supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, of Islamic movements, of the Palestinian people. But now with its former leader, Omar Bashir, having been overthrown, and a new military regime starting to take control of Sudan, we're seeing a change in Sudan. We're starting to see a Sudan that is willing to work with Israel to the expense of the Palestinians in order to secure its own interests. And this is a strategy that has been led by Netanyahu for many years now. It's a strategy that's working. Israel is starting to gain acceptance and legitimacy among Arab states in the Middle East, and the Palestinian cause is losing steam. The Israeli public are seeing that. The Israeli public support that, and it seems that this is maybe one of the reasons that the Israeli people have decided to vote for Netanyahu, despite the fact that he is likely to go to jail if he is found guilty of corruption in the trial that starts on March the 17th. Okay, well, that's me. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to be with you again next month, where Radio EastMed will continue to give you more updates from around the region in future. Thank you very much. I'm Ertan Karpazli, the editor-in-chief, and this was Radio EastMed's podcast.